What if I told you that the box score is one of the worst ways to evaluate a basketball player? Not because stats are useless, but because they only tell you how a play ends, not how it was created. And if the goal of basketball is to create the best opportunity to win, then most of the impact on the court happens where the box score isn't even looking. I would hope that we can all agree that the goal of basketball is to win. How do you win? By scoring more points than the other team. It's really that simple. As an individual, the goal of basketball is to help your team score as many points as possible while preventing the other team from scoring as many points as possible. The complexity of the sport comes from the seemingly endless amount of ways you can reach these goals. Basketball is so unique in the way that it's almost always positionless. A player's role not only changes from possession to possession, he can start a possession in one role and finish it playing a completely different one. Giannis is a great example of a guy who often starts plays as a point guard setting up the offense, then he'll shift into a center, finishing the play as a pick and roll big. After all that, he has to rush to get back on defense. There's no resting. The offense doesn't get to take a break and let their defense take the field. Every player is playing an equal amount of possessions on both sides of the ball. And on defense, you'll see the same sort of role flexibility where a guy can start on the initiator, get screened into a switch or moved onto a different spot on the court, and finish that play as his team's last line of defense. That's not to say that players don't have defined roles. You've got your shooters, your rim runners, your lead ball handlers, your defensive anchors, but in the era of pace and space, regardless of what your role is or where you spend most of your time on the court, you're constantly having to make split-second decisions that could be the difference between a layup or a turnover. So much happens on a basketball court that, as a fan, if you blink too many times, you might miss something important. And chances are, unless you rewind every possession of every game multiple times, something important happened where you weren't looking. Take this play from 9 years ago. The Cavs go to a spread pick and roll setup, and on first watch, the things that stand out are LeBron's rim pressure, an extremely high-level pass, and Kevin Love knocking down a big three to seal the game. But if we take it back to the beginning, everything started with this massive screen from Tristan Thompson. He pins Melo outside the arc, giving LeBron room to turn the corner and attack a backpedaling big. This defender's first instinct is to help, but he's guarding Kyle Korver, so he prioritizes the corner, which is what creates the space needed for LeBron to take that extra step, kick the ball out, and create an open three. 4 different players played a critical role in those 3 points. 2 of them weren't credited with a single stat on the box score. On average, an NBA game consists of close to 100 possessions. So again, if the goal of basketball is to win, the best players in the NBA are those who, over the course of 100 possessions, add as many points as possible to the offense through everything that happens on that side of the ball, and take away as many points as possible on defense through everything that happens on that side of the ball. Obviously, there's no singular number that can define the value of an individual player because there's too much nuance. A player's box score numbers can be heavily influenced by how much they have the ball. A player's scoring efficiency can be heavily influenced by spacing. A player's defensive field goal percentage can be heavily influenced by the other 4 defenders on the court. Things like plus minus or on-off can be heavily influenced by who's coming on and off the court during your minutes for both teams. The natural human aspect of things, though, is that when you can't watch hundreds and hundreds of possessions of every player in the league because there simply isn't enough time, you'll default to the easiest indicators available. Which team won and which didn't? Who stacks the most championships? Who made the All-NBA first team or won MVP? And of course, who has the most impressive box score? The problem is that the basic stats in basketball miss a ton. Like we already looked at, when a player scores a point or assists on a shot, there are typically multiple things happening away from the play that helped contribute. When a player stops a shot from going in on defense, there are so many factors from the individual on-ball pressure to the pick and roll coverage, switching, helping, and of course closing the possession on the glass. But on the topic of rebounding, only 26% of all defensive rebounds this season have been contested. So when you have guards grabbing 7 or 8 rebounds instead of 4 or 5, it might seem more impressive, even if it makes no difference whatsoever. When it comes to steals and blocks, think about it this way. Over the course of 100 possessions, the best turnover generators in NBA history are only stealing the ball 3 times, and the best shot blockers can maybe get their hands on 4 or 5 shots. What about the other 90 possessions? What about how every team who plays the Spurs refuses to go anywhere near the basket and by default chooses to settle for less efficient shots? These are the things that won't show up on a box score, but they do, however, show up in your overall influence on the scoreboard. And through decades of information, we've been able to get a decent gauge on what leads to wins. On offense, having a great isolation creator puts you at an automatic advantage. It simplifies the offense and allows you to play weaker players because these guys can break down entire defensive schemes by themselves. However, that great isolation creator starts to add more value when he's got an elite shooter to kick it out to, or a big-time lob threat, or a high-level offensive rebounder to clean up his misses. And he becomes that much more valuable with a great defensive team around him. Maybe he struggles to contain the ball, so you play him in lineups with a great point of attack defender. Maybe he struggles to protect the rim, so you put him next to a shot blocker at all times. What gets lost is that these little things start to add up and contribute to wins more than most people realize or flat out want to admit. You know what other little things start to add up? Groceries, gas, eating out, the expenses of everyday life. We all know the stress of needing cash, but having to wait impatiently for payday. Which is why I'm excited to show you a solution with today's sponsor, Clover. Clover is a financial app designed to give people quicker access to their earned money without any hidden fees. Imagine you know you need groceries but aren't sure if you can afford to load up your fridge. With Clover, you can access up to $400 before payday with no interest, credit checks, or late fees. It's important to keep in mind that Clover's mission is to help you build a healthier financial future by offering a safe, transparent, and fair alternative to predatory payday loans. So imagine the peace of mind that comes with knowing you can access up to $400 instantly with no late fees. Short on cash? Access up to $400 with no credit check or late fees. Click the link below so they know I sent you. When a player is a good scorer but doesn't do any of those little things, they often get the empty stats label. It's easy to identify when a player's ability to put the ball in the basket doesn't move the needle for a team looking to win. However, if they specialize in scoring and supplement that with secondary skills like passing, off-ball play, or defensive impact, that's when they start to get labeled as superstars. But what about those rare players who aren't great at scoring the ball, yet specialize in every single one of the little things? They get recognized as a winning player, and that's it. No awards, no name recognition, and when players specialize in the little things, then add a little bit of scoring juice, they can usually sneak onto an all-star team or two, even though they're impacting their team's ability to win on a larger scale than 99% of those primary scorers. This is where you start to run into the idea of box score bias, or more specifically scoring bias. The players with the sexiest box scores get all the hype, and it makes sense. These are your superstars, the iconic one-on-one moments, the highlight plays, the superhuman feats to escape a playoff series. They do deserve a lion's share of the credit, but sometimes the box score lies to you. Sometimes the guy who scores 15 points is contributing a lot more than the guy who scores 25. Sometimes the guy who only gets the ball when it's time to dunk has the impact of an MVP candidate. And every year, these are the guys who get overlooked. If I told you that a 32.7% three-point shooter was one of the most valuable outside shooters in the league, what would be your initial reaction? Would you think I'm drunk? Maybe think I'm losing it? I'm sure at least one person clicked off this video after hearing that. But this is exactly what I'm talking about when I say the box score sometimes tells a lie. In Game 1 of the 2022 NBA Finals, Derek White made 5 threes. After the game, Draymond went on his podcast and stated that they'll live with White getting those shots up because it's not going to beat them over the course of a series. And he was right. White only made 5 combined threes over the next 5 games, was a negative 87 on the court, and the Dubs won chip number 4. A few weeks ago, White said that Draymond's comment stuck with him, so he committed his summers to becoming as good of a shooter as possible. Over the next 3 seasons, he made 34% of his off-the-dribble threes, 41% off the catch, and almost 42% when left open. That's a seriously good shooter. Even more prominent was the volume though, as he went from a guy who'd take about 5 threes a game up to 9 in 2025, which ranked 6th in the NBA. I say all this because he's once again attempting 9 threes a game this season, but the accuracy has fallen off a cliff. The pull-up shooting's been about the same at 34%. He's just forgotten how to shoot off the catch, down at 31%, and he's made less than 36% of his wide-open looks. In total, he's down from 38.5% to the 32.7% I mentioned earlier. Obviously, you'd love for 6% more of those looks to go through and get back to what he typically shoots, but I want you to think about what this means over the course of an entire game. Over the past 3.5 years, White established himself as a consistent outside shooting threat, working with or without the ball, coming off of screens, and letting it fly with a quick trigger. Because he could do so efficiently, defenses had to legitimately start game planning to take away his three-point shot. So the real value didn't come from the 3 or 4 shots he made, it came from how the threat of those shots opened up everything for the rest of the offense. He's undeniably missing a lot of shots this year, but one thing you'll notice about all of them is that defenders don't want to leave him open. Whether they're hugging him on the perimeter or closing out hard, they don't want that ball leaving his hands with a clean look at the basket. This season, White's been on the court for about 68 possessions a game, so the difference between 32% and 38% is close to negligible as long as defenses treat him the same way. Until they stop defending him like a 40% shooter, his impact will be felt like that of a 40% shooter. Because while on those 9 possessions he isn't quite as accurate, the other 59 possessions hold the same value, and that's what accumulates to a heavy dosage of points on the scoreboard. That right there is the name of Derek White's game. He's not the type of guy you can throw the ball to and tell to go get a bucket or run an entire offense as the lead guy. What can he do? Space the floor in a ton of different ways. Play in any lineup without skipping a beat because he's a seamless fit with any collection of players. Handle the ball as much as you need him to and get everyone involved without ever turning it over. Then on defense, you name it. Want him to guard the other team's best player, fight through screens and limit their ability to create? Done. Want him to roam away from the ball, clog up lanes and protect the rim like an undersized big? Done. So what happens is that he has an unbelievable influence on the final score of the game, despite a somewhat unassuming stat line of 17 points, 5 rebounds, and 5 assists. Instead, you'll have to look into Boston's lineups to get a good grasp on his value. This season, they've outscored opponents by about 12 points per 100 with him on the court, and they've been about a neutral-ish team with him on the bench. It gets even crazier when you include all-star starter Jaylen Brown. That duo's produced a +8 net rating. When Brown's been on the court without White, they've been outscored, but when White's been on the court without Brown, they've essentially been the 2017 Warriors. Obviously, they wouldn't become a better team by just tossing Jaylen Brown to the streets of Boston, so how can we actually interpret this data? The first thing I want to look at is the correlation between how often each player in the league has the ball and how often they turn it over. You'll notice that both Derek White and Peyton Pritchard separate themselves as players who handle the ball a ton without losing it. And on the season, those two have actually had the ball even more than Brown, so that impact is reflected at the team level. Boston's second in the NBA when it comes to limiting turnovers, with a turnover percentage of just 12.7%. The only team that's ahead of them is the Thunder, who have a similar thing going on, with Shea dominating most of their touches while never turning it over. Much like OKC, the impact of not turning the ball over helps a ton on defense, because they aren't put in positions where they have to scramble to recover in transition. And as a result, the Celtics are third in the NBA in defensive transition frequency, only allowing their opponents to get out and run on 14% of their possessions. The other big value add behind turnover suppression is that you're guaranteeing a shot almost every time down. In the case of Boston, about 43.5% of their shots are three-pointers, which is once again third in the league. And it's not like they're asking poor shooters to jack up jumpers. They've got the weapons. But what truly takes this offense to another level is the way they crash off of those threes. Not only do all of their bigs clean the offensive glass, their role-playing wings like Ron Harper Jr., Jordan Walsh, and Hugo Gonzalez all do a great job of tracking down long rebounds. So as a team, once again, they're in the top 5 with an offensive rebounding percentage of 33.8%. When you combine the turnover suppression with all of those second chances, you're left with a unit that simply gets more opportunities to score than their opponents, while simultaneously taking away the easiest opportunities in transition. So how does that relate to Jaylen Brown? If we go back to those turnover numbers, you'll notice that he actually stands out as somebody who doesn't take great care of the ball. He also doesn't grab any offensive rebounds and isn't necessarily a great three-point shooter. So the winning formula for Boston exists whether he's on the court or not. However, his inside-the-arc shot creation and versatility as a man defender are critical for them in key matchups, so the on-off numbers aren't as black and white as they might seem. Derek White, on the other hand, is their most impactful defender while having a direct influence on their three-point rate and turnover suppression, which in turn influences their transition defense, meaning the winning formula doesn't hold up quite as well when he sits. I guess the main takeaway here is that Derek White should have been an all-star, and it's not just because of plus-minus. So many different factors play into these numbers, like everyone who comes on and off the court for both teams, what the situation of the game is, and sometimes just sheer luck. However, Boston's success from day one of this season, as a team that's on pace to win 54 games, has been directly tied to whether or not White's on the court, and he's not the only one. If we take it out west, the Wolves with Rudy Gobert and Ant on the court together have a +7 net rating. When Ant's on the court without Rudy, they're about average, but when Rudy's on the court without Ant, that's when the Wolves seem to be at their best. And if your concern is sample size, here's how that looks since Gobert arrived in Minnesota 4 years ago. As a duo, +5.5. With just Ant, +2. With just Rudy, +7. And with neither of them, still winning those minutes. Again, I'll reiterate, this doesn't mean Rudy's by default the most impactful or best player on the Wolves. However, it does show that the team's identity fails to exist without his presence. What this signifies signal tells us is that Gobert is what moves the needle from a middle of the pack type of team to a legitimate Western Conference contender. And when you look under the hood, that impact starts to reveal itself in a number of ways. With Gobert on the court, the Wolves have allowed the lowest field goal percentage of any team at the rim, and with him off the court, they're about middle of the pack. With Gobert, they allow the 7th fewest shot attempts at the rim, as opposed to dead last without him. Those shots are replaced by long twos when he's on the court, the worst shot in basketball. And the added misses, along with his prowess on the glass, turn them into a top 10 defensive rebounding team. That rebounding impact works both ways, as he single-handedly takes them from the worst second-chance team in the league to number 6. And his presence inside provides a huge boost to their field goal percentage at the rim, the difference between number 2 and number 17. Essentially, having Gobert on the court allows you to control the painted area on both sides of the ball. We view his skill set as a specialized role because he isn't handling the ball, creating, or adding value through his scoring. But when it comes to influencing the final score, not many players can compare. What gets lost in all of this, though, is how a player's skill set alters the types of lineups their team can go to on the court. Sticking with Gobert for a sec, you have to surround him with as many ball handlers and shooters as possible, or you're going to be dealing with an extremely clogged offense. And the way to do that typically means sacrificing some level of defensive versatility. Look no further than those last few iterations of the Jazz, who built the perfect regular season team. Tons of ball handlers and playmakers, elite three-point shooting around Gobert, knowing that he'd be able to single-handedly carry them to a top 5 defense. Then what happened? Playoff offenses schemed to get Rudy as far away from the basket as possible. Not to attack him, but to attack everyone else while making sure he couldn't help. And that lack of defensive versatility ended up being their downfall. That brings me back to the complexity of basketball and the constant relationship between offense and defense. We've already gone over how a player taking care of the ball can positively influence his team's defense, even if that's an offensive trait. Similarly, certain skill sets can either positively or negatively influence other areas of the game based on who you can put next to them. The ultimate example of this is Steph Curry, who pops up in lots of defensive metrics as an all-defensive candidate. I actually think he's been pretty underrated on that end of the court historically, but we obviously know that it's not to that extent. However, because he's such a complete outlier when it comes to moving without the ball and shooting, he creates advantages for his team on the perimeter in a way we've never seen, leaving teammates with space to cut or drive into layups. As a result, Golden State could always play multiple non-shooters in the same lineups, which meant they could slant towards defense. Guys like Gary Payton II, Draymond Green, Andre Iguodala, Kevon Looney, and plenty of others played critical roles in championship caliber offenses despite posing little scoring threat. So Steph's unique offensive skill set actually played a huge role in making the Warriors a defensive dynasty. Of course, all of this just comes back to the impossibility of trying to get to the bottom of how valuable these things are. Like I mentioned earlier, lineup data can get us close, but that doesn't account for who's going off the court with each guy for both teams, as well as game situation, and that's why we need the help of advanced metrics to get a more accurate depiction. I'm not talking about the PER or box plus minus you'll find on Basketball Reference. I'm talking about metrics that actually dive into this lineup data and help sort the outliers for us without having to go into every team manually. For that, we'll have to look at adjusted plus minus. If you're unfamiliar with the metric, I'll link a couple articles where one of the pioneers, Jeremiah Engelman, thoroughly explains the ins and outs. But to dumb it down, the intent of the stat is to determine a player's true contribution to the score of a basketball game by looking at every permutation of every lineup and applying the proper context, with no influence whatsoever from the box score. Needless to say, this sort of data requires a large sample of different types of lineups, so it typically takes stretches of 3 to 5 years to truly isolate an individual's impact. But even then, it isn't perfect. For starters, it isn't always able to completely separate individuals from their teammates. A good example of that would be the Clippers in the mid-2010s. Doc Rivers infamously used the platoon swap, meaning he'd take all or most of his starters off the court at the same time. Chris Paul's impact was directly tied to DeAndre Jordan's because the two basically never played without each other, and it was only in missed games that we'd get a decent sample of one without the other. Still though, adjusted plus minus is the closest we've gotten to truly being able to see how much one individual influences the success of his team. Different variations of adjusted plus minus get to that goal in slightly different ways, but that goal remains the same. For this exercise, we're going to be looking at RAPM from NBARAPM.com. Over the last 3 seasons, the top 10 players probably aren't what you'd expect. These numbers are in terms of impact per 100 possessions, meaning Shea in first place is worth about 9.3 points per 100 to the Thunder, while Jokic in second is worth about 8.8 to the Nuggets. Those two are followed by Giannis, Wemby, Gobert, Kawhi, Mitchell, and Halliburton. No surprises. At 9th, you run into Lauri Markkanen, an interesting case of a clearly impactful player who spent these years on a tanking team. And then at 10th, it gets really interesting because that's where you've got Alex Caruso. I want to pause on Caruso for a second because he's an extreme case of a guy who doesn't provide any value with his scoring whatsoever, but every team he's ever played for has been leaps and bounds better when he's on the court, including his 2 NBA championships. That's the result of an unbelievable defensive impact, capable of excelling in any role on that side of the ball, while being just good enough to stay on the floor offensively. One of the cool things about adjusted plus minus is that it's the foundation for basically every metric you've heard of. Box plus minus, estimated plus minus, LeBron. They're all formulated to get as close to adjusted plus minus as they possibly can while including the box score so that you can get a more accurate depiction of who the most valuable players are in smaller samples, like a single season. I wanted to know what these metrics thought of the current season, so I went and found the 5 that I see most commonly used by the public, and I combined them into one sort of overall impact metric, if you will. Some of these metrics value the box score heavier than others, some include tracking data, some are more geared towards the plus-minus side of things, but all of them attempt to account for value per 100 possessions. Remember though, I started this video talking about how the box score misses a ton. So here's a look at the relationship between impact and stats. From top to bottom is an estimate of how many points each player adds to their team, and from left to right is how many points, rebounds, and assists they rack up while doing so. It is worth noting that there's a pretty strong correlation. Generally, your stat stuffers are your most valuable players, but a few guys stand out as adding tons of value beyond the box score like Shea and Jokic, Wemby, Kawhi, or more importantly, the kings of the little things like Jimmy Butler, Chet Holmgren, Derek White, AJ Mitchell, or Neemias Queta. On the inverse, some players stuff the stat sheet but don't influence their team's success as much as you'd think. That's where you'll find LeBron James, Julius Randle, Josh Giddey, Paolo Banchero, and even some guys who dip into the negative territory like Keontae George, Alex Sarr, or Russell Westbrook. One thing you'll notice is that all 3 of those guys play on some of the worst teams in basketball, and it's important to keep in mind that numbers are situational. Just because a player has an immensely positive or negative impact in one situation doesn't mean that it would automatically translate. Who knows what Gobert's impact would look like on a team with no shooters, or what White's impact would look like on a team that doesn't have a proven winning formula. What we do know though is that basic numbers aren't always able to capture what leads to winning basketball. Guys like Rudy Gobert or Derek White might not pop off the stat sheet, but they influence winning in so many different ways that over the course of a game and eventually a season, they produce the signal of an all-NBA player. And on the inverse, every year you have plenty of guys who fill the stat sheet with points, rebounds, and assists, but don't do any of the little things or struggle to put the ball in the basket efficiently, and they'll often get credited with all-star appearances or superstar labels despite influencing winning on a marginal level, or very rarely sometimes even hurting their teams. That's not to say that the box score or statistics for that matter are completely useless. If a player scores the ball at a high volume, efficiently, defenses are probably forced to react. If a player shoots 10 threes a game at a 40% clip, he probably provides a ton of space. If a player grabs a ton of offensive rebounds and doesn't turn the ball over, he's probably a positive influence on his team's scoring opportunities. If a player picks up tons of steals and blocks, he's probably an active defender. Basic numbers can be helpful. All I'm saying is to not lean on them too heavily, take everything you see with a grain of salt, and trust your eyes to apply the needed context. And when I say eyes, I don't mean highlight reels. I don't mean aesthetics. The eye test should be about identifying what's happening on the court at the team level and how each individual influences that. Maybe next time you watch a game, try to look away from the ball for a few possessions. Take a peek at how the offense is set up, what they're doing to create space, and also look at how the defense brings help, where and when it comes, what they're looking to take away, and how the offense eventually counters. So much happens on the basketball court. I can't stress that enough. And when looking for the little things, you might find a new appreciation for those hidden impact players that often move the needle for championship contenders.